Welcome back friends once again. In this video we look at another enhancement of the knife game where we create animation of the knives between levels. Right now, to make my point clear on what do I mean by this, let me just show you the original class game as well as an enhanced game, right, to make myself clear. Right, notice that in the original game, when we hit, for example, let's say, so when I get 10 knives hit on the yeah, so I still have one more to do. So when I do 10 knives, then I get the sound and then I immediately get the next level, right? Okay, so here I've done the falling animation, but I've not done this aspect, right? So I get 3 knives and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if I go into the enhanced game, which is also shared with you, uh, okay, so it just loads for a moment. Notice here what happens is once I do finish my 10 knives, so these knives do some kind of a dance, right? In fact, if you have seen the bonus ideas video, you realize that there are two ways this is done. One is somewhat simpler and one is a little bit more involved, right? So this is the more involved method. And if I, let's say, went and changed my code a little bit in here, so I'll go to the throwing knives, and I've got this two of these. So this code is quite complicated. I wouldn't want you to kind of try to copy this line by line, but try to understand what's going on, and that's why these videos, right? So let's say instead of this broadcast, if let's say I used this one, right, so then we'll get a slightly simpler effect. So I notice that here all the knives are doing something similar, and also the original knife is also showing whatever dance we are doing, right? So this is the simpler part of the animation, but we'll look at both of these, right? So let me just restore my code back to the more advanced one, which uses slightly more advanced logic, right? So I'll just test this one. So basically here, all right, notice that nothing happens to the advanced, the original clone, but original sprite, but the clones do some kind of animation, right? So this is what we are going to see. Now this is actually quite complicated, right? This requires a lot of steps. So let me just tell you what is it that we are going to do before we get on to writing the code, right? So I'll come back here and I'll tell you the idea here, right? Now, the first thing that we are going to have to do is that at the end of a level, we will hide the log and we'll also remove the existing fixed knives. Now, the reason we need to do this is because if let's say we did not do this, right, then it's quite possible that during this animation, right, because this animation, these knives are moving around randomly. So, it's possible that they may hit the fixed knife or they may hit the log and so on and so forth. They may hit another knife. Uh, and hence you may end up losing life, right? So to avoid all of those problems, we'll just hide and delete the log and the fixed knife clones respectively, right? So that those remain out of picture, right? Now once that is done, we will animate the knives. Right now there are, again, like I said, there are two options. The simpler one is using only a broadcast, so it's actually quite nice. But there are two things to keep in mind. One is that the original sprite, which means the knife that is sitting on the at the bottom of the screen, that also gets animated, and also all the clones pretty much do the same thing. So it's little less, a little bit, let's say, restrictive that sense, right? Option two, which is more advanced, right, will use broadcast and local variables. Right now, local variables are variables only for the sprite. Like I think I might have mentioned elsewhere, this is used. We'll learn about this more carefully when we get into games like Snake and so on, right? But we'll use both of this, and what this will do amazingly is that it will prevent original sprite from getting cloned. Sorry, actually getting animated is the right word here. So this knife, noticed, was completely stationary, and in fact we'll get the different clones to do somewhat differently, right? So this is the idea, and once all this animation is done, then we bring back the log, and then the game kind of restarts, right? So that's the sort of high level idea, and I wanted to give you this picture before we get onto the code. Now, in terms of the coding, right? So almost all the action is going to happen in the throwing knife sprite, which is called knife throwing in this game. And in fact, as you can imagine, everything really happens at the end of a level, which is essentially the end of this part of the code. So when the knives left become 0, so which means all the knives have been thrown, that is when everything has to happen, right? So what we are going to do is that we are going to call a bunch of broadcasts here, and then later on fill in this broadcast. So like I said, the first thing we are going to do is that, so I'm going not to do not I'll not play a sound here. Instead, what I'll do is that I will broadcast a message called hide log. The idea being that with this message we'll hide the log, right? So I'll say a new message. Let's say hide log. Uh, Next, I will broadcast messages to remove the older clones of the fixed knife, right? Remember the uh, new clones will anyway be removed. I mean, the throwing knives will be removed anyway later on when I receive, when I say remove past knives, but the fixed knives must be removed. So I'm going to say broadcast, let's say over here, uh, broadcast remove, I think it's called remove older knives in my older game. So remove older knives and wait. So when I get, say when I, in the fixed knife I have, yeah, so when I receive older knife, delete this clone, which means all the fixed knives will get deleted from here. This statement is already done. In fact, I mean, I have the, when I receive corresponding, I call this. Now I'm going to create one more broadcast here, right? And let's say I'm just going to call it animate. So I'll call it, let's say, animate, say knives between levels, right? I mean, rather long name, but it's very clear. So I'm going to say animate lives between levels and wait. Once that animation is over, I'll come back here. So because this broadcast and wait, so it will basically complete all of that. It'll come back here. I'll say change level by 1, right? Now I must display the log, right? So I must display the log, which means I'm going to create one more message here, broadcast message, and I'll call it, say, broadcast, new message here, display log, uh, and then I will, just basically, the same flow follows, right? So I'll just say, okay, broadcast new fixed knives, new throwing knives, which means anyway, these have been removed, so it doesn't matter. There's no, the level has been increased, so there's no older knives to worry about, but still it will keep continue to work, right? And I don't need this 0.1 seconds here, right? Now, with this done, I'll also go to my log sprite and I'll put a message here that when I receive, let's say, hide log. So when I receive hide log, I can hide myself, right? So I can, let's say, in the looks, I can go and say hide, right? I'll go and say hide. And when I receive, let's say, display log, I will display myself, right? So that this way, so basically I'll show myself, right? So here I've added a little bit of code on the log sprite, right? But pretty much everything else will happen on the, on the, let's say, on the throwing knife sprite. All right, so now I'm going to start describing what happens when I receive animate knives between levels, because remember that's the broadcast being sent from there. And now I'm going to have to describe what happens here, right? So like I said, there are two options. First, let's look at the simpler option, which is that every knife clone does, the same thing, right? Uh, First thing, realize that once it's a broadcast, it's being sent to everybody, which means all the clones receive this broadcast, right? So whatever I put in here, every clone is going to do the same thing, right? So I can say, okay, I can say start sound, let's say, maybe not connect, but I think I used another sound here. Let me just get another sound on this, right? The sound I liked here, I mean, again, you can change this. I use the symbol echo, this one, right? So again, this just so it kind of sounds nice. So I will say start sound, say, symbol echo. Now after this point, I want these knives to be animated, right? But I want them to kind of twist and turn a little bit. However, remember one thing, that when we had first built this game, we had in fact arranged their costumes in a very special way, which means these costumes are in fact offset from the center, right? But and whenever you have this for an animation, it's going to be very hard. So I will duplicate this costume, and make it costume 2. But this time around, very importantly, I'm going to just set this back in the center, right? So if I did this, I put this back nicely in the center, then I have a better control on what's going on, right? So what I'm going to do is that when I receive this broadcast, I'm going to say, okay, please, in this whole thing, I'm going to say switch costume to costume 2, which means all the clones will basically become centered nicely now. And now I can say, okay, I can move these knives somewhere across the whole, let's say, wherever they are, I can move them around a little bit. So I can say change, say, x by, uh, you know, change x by, let's say, pick a random number between, say, minus 200 and 200. So I'll say change x by, say, uh, minus 200 to, say, 200. And now I want these guys to do some kind of a dance. So, I just use a simple one. I'll say repeat, say, repeat maybe perhaps say 50 times, right? And what I can do is to say, okay, change x by, so first this x will make them move all across the screen, and now I can give them a little bit of a shake and a jerk, right? So like, for example, change x by a little number and so on, so for change y by some number. So I'll just duplicate this, I don't need the second repeat here. This is rather rigorous, so I don't need to, maybe do so much. I'll say minus 10 to plus 10. Similarly, I can just say change y by some number. So here I'll go and say, say for example, change y by perhaps something. I'll duplicate this again, and here I can maybe say a small number. Let's say -2 to say -2 to say -3, so that it starts to fall down a little bit, but in sort of small steps, right? And then I can also turn them a little bit, so that creates a nice effect that they're all doing something, right? So I'll just say turn by a random amount, right? So all of these will basically do, as a turn, let's say, by some random amount, and in this case I'm going to put, say, random degrees of, say -10 to say 10 degrees, right? I mean, these are all numbers which I've just chosen. There's no you can do it differently in short, right? So I'm just going to say stop all sounds. Right now this is quite interesting, because when the game starts, okay, so first thing first, when the flag is clicked, I must make sure that I switch back to costume number one, because remember, now we have two costumes, so I have to be careful. I'll say switch costume to costume one, because that's the one that has been aligned to rotate with the with the log, right? So once the game starts now, now notice something interesting happened, that even the original knife was basically animated, right? Which means that whenever I get back to this point, whenever the new throwing knife is mentioned here, I have to uh, basically, when the flag is clicked, I whatever I'm doing here, uh, not here, sorry, not here. I'm going to go into when the flag is clicked, right? So all of this code, basically these two, I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to have to put them also when I receive the new throwing knives, right? Because when new level starts, all this must happen again. The knife must go back to its original position and stay upright, right? So I have to make these changes, because the original knife is getting affected right now, right? So let me just make this change here. So I'll do this, right? And with this, what will happen is that I expect that between levels, those knives will start to sort of behave, fine, right? In fact, I'll have to also set the costume here, right? So I'll say switch costume to say costume one, uh, because this costume is being changed, right? So let's see if this works. Yeah, so first level got over, and then again I get back to this. Right now, why did all the knives get animated? Well, because everybody, including the original clone, got this message that look, animate knives. And once it got this broadcast, then all it had to do really, each one of them did this, right? So they changed randomly by X, so it went somewhere. It also started dance along with these knives, which is fine, right? But we had to do a little bit more work in some sense, and also all the knives were doing pretty much the same thing, right? All right, so now let's say we want to do something a little bit more advanced. So what we can do is that we can, say disconnect this particular broadcast for now. I'm going to just say, I'm just going to duplicate this so that I have both the options available later on. So I can say, well, again, I'm going to say start, let's say symbol echo 2. So that sound is nice. So I'll say start the sound. But thereafter, I want to do something interesting, something that only the knives which are sitting on top here do, right? So for that purpose, I'm going to use a bunch of local variables, which are variables only for the sprite, and that will allow me to figure out if I'm talking of the original sprite or these sprites here, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a new variable here, uh, and I'm going to make it, I'm calling it am I a clone, right? And with a question mark. Now whenever this happens, it's like asking a question, and hence the answer is either yes or no. Importantly, I'm going to make this for this sprite only, and that's what I meant by local variables. So when I do this, so when the flag is clicked, I'm going to say set am I a clone to say 0. However, the moment I start as a clone, right? So the whole idea of this variable is that every clone should set this to 1. So say when I start this as, say when I start as a clone, I can immediately set this as set am I a clone to, let's say, 1, because a clone, so this variable gets set to 1 for the clone and 0 for the original sprite, right? So basically original sprite is 0, but the moment a clone is created, I get I basically let's say set this variable to 1, right? So now this allows me the to distinguish between the original sprite and the clone. So okay, so and now I want only the clones to be animated. So what I can do is that everything I can put inside this mega if statement. And this if statement just says, am I a clone is 1 or not? So if I'm a clone, then I do all this, otherwise I do not do all this. So this prevents my original sprite from getting animated, right? So because remember, original sprite, this variable is set to 0, right? So now this happens only for a clone. Now what do I do? Well, once again, I'm going to have to animate this. So I'll basically copy this statement here. I'll duplicate, I'll switch the costume to costume 2. Okay, I don't need to do this. Switch costume to costume 2. And now I'm also going to move them randomly to their own, like random places around the whole thing. So just let it be. So I'm going to say moved randomly to different places. And now, given that I have control on each clone, I can in fact give every clone a different behavior, right? So in fact, this is very similar to what we'll do in the fruit slasher game future. But what I'll do here is to create a bunch of local variables again. All these variables will be for this sprite only. So I'll call them say x speed. For this sprite only, I'll create one more variable called say y speed, again for this sprite only, which means each clone will have its own copy. And finally, I'll create one more local variable here called let's say let's call it t, which what I mean is like turning directions, right? And also this will be for this sprite only, right? So these variables are local. And now if I'm not a clone, then I'm going to set, let's say, so I'm going to say set x speed to say a random number between -5 and 5. So which means that each clone can have a different x speed. So let's say between say okay -5 and 5. Now again, these are just numbers that I've chosen to be to be whatever they are. So, and I'm going to say set y speed to say, for example, a random number between say 10 and 15. Right now, again, all of this we are going to cover later on when we do platformer or say the fruit slasher, because there are significant similarities between this particular thing and that. But you can still see it today, right? I'm going to say turning direction to, let's say, a random number between -10 and 10. Now, again, these are just my numbers. You could do it differently as well, right? So I say -10 and 10. And now what I do is that I repeat, let's say, this whole thing, say by 50 times. I repeat this whole thing by 50 times. And what I do is that instead of this random numbers here, I'm going to say change x by x speed, y by y speed, and turning direction by t rate, right? So I say change x by x speed, change y by, say, y by y speed, and this by turning direction. Now, extremely important. I must, change my y speed by -1. And the reason for this will become clear when we do the platformer, because we want this guys to actually come down, right? In fact, this is an important point. So what I will do is that I'll say change y speed by say -1. So this will ensure that the clone will continue to actually fall, right? So it will fall down. And then, if y position becomes quite a pretty low, then I can just hide this clone, right? So that, it goes out of the view, right? So I'm just going to put a control statement here saying that if, let's say, y position of this clone becomes less than some number. So say, for example, y position is less than minus 150. So here is say y position is less than say -150. Now this is my number. Basically I would say that once it goes below a certain level, I am going to say just hide, right? So I'll say, for example, hide here. And that's pretty much it, right? So all of this happens only for the sprites that are, I mean, only for the clone and not for everybody else, right? So the original sprite doesn't do anything, and we get a more, let's say, so I'm going to hide all these variables because they're occupying a lot of space on the screen. And so I'm going to just say, am I a clone? These are all local variables. That's why you see this knife throwing hyphen that. But with this, I think I can show you. Notice original sprite, nothing happened, and all these sprite had like a jumping movement upwards, and then they came down, right? And all this is the magic of local variables. Once again, right? We saw the same effect, right? Little bit complicated, but if you do this, if you try to understand what's going on here, you can imagine, this sets you up beautifully for games like platformers, for games like fruit slasher and so on and so forth, right? Which we'll cover in the advanced level. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.